Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. We have a fun one for you tonight. We're going to talk about the legend of King Arthur and the Round Table and Camelot and Excalibur, which was the sword that he pulled out of the rock. This was a legend largely because over the last couple of hundred years, as they've continued to look at it, more and more historians have determined that there was no real King Arthur in terms of being one person, that King Arthur was a composite of multiple historical figures. And what we'll do is we'll get into all the aspects of the legend tonight. And we'll get into the history of the legend as it changed over the centuries, what was added to the story and when it was added to the story, and also who were the individuals that King Arthur was potentially based on as a historical figure and a composite figure. And then we'll also talk about some of the history that has been uncovered recently. We'll also talk about some of the history that was uncovered recently, including the grave site that some now propose was King Arthur and Guinevere's grave that they shared together. There's a lot of people that are very skeptical about that, but there's some that truly believe it. So it's going to be a fun one tonight because we're going to be talking about the various aspects of this legend that went through multiple centuries just after the Roman period in England when they left Roman Britannia. This legend started in Welsh poetry around the 6th century AD, and the Welsh poetry would mention this King Arthur, this historical figure, and then he was continued to be talked about for hundreds of years and embellished all the way up through the end of the 13th century by French Romantic writers who took the King Arthur story and embellished it by adding more characters and adding more aspects and angles to the story. What most historians now believe is that King Arthur was, as I said, a composite figure of multiple people, and he was a symbol for the British people at a time when they were desperate for a hero. This was a time right after Rome had left and right when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Vikings were all coming in and invading their island, and in most cases they couldn't do anything about it. They had to just keep getting pushed further and further west. And so the legend began then when the people who were natives to the English Isles really felt like they needed a hero like King Arthur. And so that's what most historians believe, is that this tale and this legend continued to grow and grow as the people needed this hero in their lives to give them some hope and give them some ability over time to resist the invaders that were coming in. It's a really fascinating story. We loved it as a kid. There have been many, many movies made about it, TV shows, cartoons, books, and all kinds of different ways that Western culture has romanticized this true legend, King Arthur and his court. And so let's go ahead and get into the legend, the history behind it, what's history and what's fiction, and what was embellished over time. Here we go. All right, so this is the legend of King Arthur, history or fiction. And you can see some incredible photos here. The first one is a true statue there on the top left. That is over in Western England in an area where they thought maybe King Arthur might have been from, or where he ruled for some time if he did exist. You can see another picture just to the right of him there, of him putting the crown on himself when he took over as king, purportedly. Part of the legend down the bottom left there is when he pulled the sword from the stone, which gave him the rights and the lineage to take over as king at that time. And you can see his various knights were sitting there in that picture looking at him pull the sword from the stone. Some other epic photos here of him with his court and around his round table in Camelot, which is a famous round table that gets talked about in the legend. Just above that is a cup, and that is the Holy Grail, which, of course, was purportedly the last cup that Jesus drank from during the Last Supper. And there's been many, many people that have been searching for the Holy Grail for many, many years. We'll talk about how King Arthur is intertwined with that Holy Grail legend as well. And then finally, you see to the right 3 pictures there of Arthur looking at his magical sword that he pulled from the rock and also leading his men into battle. So you can see this legend as it grew over the centuries just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So one thing we need to talk about as we set up the discussion about King Arthur and this legend is what was happening as the Romans left the English Isle and retreated back to protect Italy and other areas of the empire. They could no longer protect England. So what happened as the Romans left was Angles and Saxons and Jutes that were originating from Germany and Poland and other areas of Europe. And they began their migrations by coming over in ships and taking over substantial portions of England, as you can see there in the map. This happened because there was a huge vacuum of power after the Romans left. And then migration really marked a significant turning point in English history as they established settlements around the land and introduced distinct culture that was different from the British Isles that they were used to. Between 410 and 1066, which is, of course, the time when William the Conqueror came and brought a whole new age in, these groups forged a new society characterized by traditions, craftsmanship, governance, and ultimately laying the foundations for medieval English culture. Their villages, often built with timber and featuring thatched roof huts, were at the heart of Anglo-Saxon life. These rural communities thrived on agriculture and trade and supported by skilled artisans and craftsmen who were creating intricate jewelry and weaponry and religious artifacts. So you can imagine what a shock to the system this was for the people that were local to England, to have all these different tribes coming in and settling and building kingdoms of their own and getting pushed further and further west, as you can see in the picture there, that the original people that were locals who had mixed with the Roman tribes continued to get pushed west. And these were the people that historians believe very much started the King Arthur legend, whether he was really a king or whether he was a composite king of multiple people. It was because they were hanging on to his legend as a form of hope to give them something to hang on to as their land continued to change. So that gives you a good foundational thought about what was happening at the time with the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain. So King Arthur's legend is a foundational myth in Britain telling of a legendary king who united the land, ruled from Camelot with his knights of the Round Table, and sought the Holy Grail, but whose kingdom fell due to betrayal, notably the affair between his queen, Guinevere, and Sir Lancelot, who was one of the knights of the Round Table. And this, of course, led to his tragic end and promised to return as the once and future king. So they really believed that not only did he live and was he a true king that united England, but that he will come back in the future when they need him. The stories were blending of Celtic folklore, medieval romance, and they center on his magical birth, his kingship, proven by pulling of Excalibur from the stone, and his eventual death after being mortally wounded fighting Mordred, who was his mortal enemy, after which he is taken to Avalon, which is a fictitious island. Most historians believe King Arthur was not actually a historical figure and was based on multiple kings and historical figures as a composite figure who evolved through the centuries of English history and lore. The settled legend says he was son of King Uther Pendragon and Igraine as his mother, and he was raised in secret by Merlin, who was a wizard who was a friend of the family. He proved his divine right by drawing Excalibur, the sword, from a stone or anvil, depending on the version. So you can see the sword was actually an anvil when the legend started. His magnificent court, where knights sat at a round table, symbolizing equality, and pledged to chivalric ideas. The Holy Grail was a mystical cup sought by the knights, representing spiritual purity achieved by Galahad eventually. And of course, that cup, as we mentioned, was Jesus's cup from the Last Supper. Arthur was purportedly mortally wounded by Mordred at the Battle of Camlann, and Arthur was taken to the mystical island of Avalon and fated to return when he was needed, but he did pass away at that mystical island. So that's a little bit about his legend, and we'll get into some more of the details of all the different characters in it and all the different occurrences that happened in his life. So Arthur's Camelot, you can see a picture of what the artist at the time felt like Camelot might have looked like as a walled and magical city and castle. Camelot was a legendary castle and court associated with King Arthur. Absent in the early Arthurian material, however, Camelot first appeared in the 12th century French romances and eventually came to be described as the fantastic capital of Arthur's realm and symbol of Arthurian's world. So you can see this is another example of something that was not in the early legends that came out of Welsh literature and Celtic literature, but was added much later in the 12th century by a French romanticist. Medieval texts located somewhere in Great Britain and sometimes associated with real cities, though usually its precise location is not revealed. Most scholars regard it as being entirely fictional, its unspecified geography being perfect for chivalric romance writers. Nevertheless, arguments about the location of the real Camelot have occurred since the 15th century. So there's been a lot of arguing over the last couple of centuries about whether was it a real city, where it might have been, and there are many historians that argue about it all the time in different areas of England. Historians have suggested a deviation from the British Iron Age and a Romano-British place called Camelundum, one of the first capitals of Roman Britain, and which would have significance in Roman British culture. So there's a real possibility, and they think actually maybe the most likely, if it was a real city, was this Romano-British place called Camelundum. Indeed, John Morris, the English historian who specialized in the study of institutions of the Roman Empire and the history of sub-Roman Britain, suggested in his book, The Age of Arthur, that as the descendants of Romanized Britons, and they looked back to a golden age of peace and prosperity under Roman Britannia. So again, that's where they really believe these legends came from. The Arthurian legends was the Britons who were there before the Anglo-Saxon tribes came in. And they were really looking back as the Roman period in a very romanticized way, in a longing way. They wish they could get back to that golden age. And that's what Camelot and Arthur really represented. So let's talk about the Round Table at Camelot, one of the most famous aspects of the overall legend. The Round Table is King Arthur's famed table in the Arthurian legend, around which he and his knights congregate and meet and discuss future plans. As its name suggests, it had no head, implying that everyone who sits there has equal status. That was unlike conventional rectangular tables where participants order themselves according to rank. So this was a really revolutionary idea at the time, to think about a king at the head of a table, which is what it normally was, and everybody else reporting to him. In this situation, he and his very righteous knights, as they sat around the round table, were all equal in their minds. The table was first described in 1155 by Wace, who was another author at the time, and he relied on previous depictions of Arthur's fabulous retinue. The symbolism of the Round Table developed over time. By the close of the 12th century, it had come to represent the chivalric order associated with Arthur's court, the Knights of the Round Table. So it really did represent that feeling that all the participants were equal, but also that all of them had tremendous chivalry and great respect for each other. Though the Round Table is not mentioned in the earliest accounts of King Arthur, tales of King Arthur having a marvelous court made up of many prominent warriors are ancient and go all the way back to the Welsh poems. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Historia Regum Britanniae, which was in 1136, says that after establishing peace throughout Britain, Arthur increased his personal entourage by inviting very distinguished men from far distant kingdoms to join him at the Round Table. The code of chivalry was so important in later medieval romance figures in it as well. As Geoffrey says, Arthur established such a code of courtliness in his household that he inspired people living far away to imitate him. So you can see the kind of impact Arthur was having in his legend on the way that the society was ordered after that in all different European countries around the world. You can see some great pictures there of Arthur standing up at the round table with all of his knights assembled. And there were many, many paintings and pictures of this that have happened over all the centuries that were part of this legend. Let's talk about Lancelot and Guinevere. The core story of Lancelot and Guinevere's love affair first appears in the 12th century French poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which was written by Chatin de Troyes, and it was around 1170 to 1180 when it was written. And it became a central detail part of the Arthurian legend later on. So you can see the Lancelot and Guinevere characters were very much added on to the Arthurian legends much later because of this French writer. Notably, these characters were then developed even more in the 13th century Vulgate cycle and Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century La Morte d'Arthur. Lancelot emerges as a knight, and Chatin's Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, introduces him as Guinevere's devoted lover and rescuer, establishing their passionate love affair. The French Vulgate cycle further develops Lancelot's character and his adulterous relationship with Guinevere, making it a central theme of the Arthurian legends. Lancelot is King Arthur's most valued knight of the Round Table and a paragon of courage and virtue. Things change, however, when he falls in love with Arthur's bride, Queen Guinevere. In order to marry Guinevere, King Arthur must find a knight to defeat Leodogran's champion. Arthur chooses Lancelot as his champion, who mortally wounds his opponent on the field. On the way back to Camelot, Lancelot foils an attempt on Guinevere's life by Sir Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son and main rival in the story. And before the end of the journey, Lancelot and Guinevere realize their love for each other. Though Lancelot is loyal to Arthur and Guinevere, their marriage takes place as planned. It is not long before the two become lovers behind Arthur's back. You see some great pictures there of Arthur in the middle as king with his bride Guinevere, and then his knight Lancelot to his left. And then a picture of Lancelot and her having a romantic moment in one of the stories. So you can see this was very much added much later on as a romantic part of the story that was not there as part of the earlier legends. So who was the Lady of the Lake and Excalibur? Lady of the Lake, or in French, Dame du Lac, is a title used by multiple characters in the legend of King Arthur as either actual fairy or fairy-like human enchantresses. They play important roles in various stories, notably by providing Arthur with the sword Excalibur, eliminating the wizard Merlin, raising the knight Lancelot after the death of his father, and helping to take the dying Arthur to Avalon after his final battle. So what's really interesting is these fairy-like characters were very important in literature back then and appeared in many different ways in many different stories. Many people thought the Lady of the Lake, who was a fairy, was only in the scene where she brings this sword for him. What most people don't realize is that these fairy characters appeared in many different stories with Arthur and with Lancelot. And so they were very important as mythical characters, almost like angels in a religious story. The Lady of the Lake is best known as a character called Nimue. Fairies are one of the most important elements of Arthurian fantasy stories. They are supernatural beings of Celtic origin, often fatal women, whose figures are an extension of the nymphs and goddesses of antiquity. Knights searching for adventures meet these women with strange powers in the dark and deep forests, but also in the castles that stand in their roads. Beneficial or malicious, they often hide their nature under the guise of a virgin in distress in order to test the bravery and virtue of the knights. Excalibur is a mythical sword of King Arthur that possesses magical powers and is associated with the rightful sovereignty of Britain. Its first reliably datable appearance is found in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae. Excalibur is the sword of the stone, functioning as proof of Arthur's lineage, featured throughout most works dealing with Arthur. You see a great picture there of Arthur about to pull the sword out of the stone next to the lake. And then there's a picture of the Lady of the Lake holding the sword itself. So let's talk about some of the legendary events that happened with Arthur throughout the centuries. There are legendary events involving King Arthur found in early texts like the Historia Brittonum and Annales Cambriae, center on major battles against Anglo-Saxons, especially the decisive victory at the Battle of Badon, which happened around 500 AD, and his final fatal clash with Mordred at the Battle of Camlann, which happened at 537 AD. Later medieval tales, notably Geoffrey of Monmouth's book that we talked about, expanded these to include continental conquests against Romans and giants and his eventual journey to Avalon, cementing his legendary status as a British hero and ideal king for the people. The 9th century Historia Brittonum lists 12 battles that Arthur fought, culminating in the great victory at Badon, where he purportedly slew 960 men by himself. Mentioned in the 10th century Annales Cambriae, this battle marks Arthur's death or mortal wounding alongside his rival Mordred. Geoffrey's 12th century Historia Regum Britanniae transformed Arthur into a continental conqueror, battling Romans in Gaul and even sacking Rome itself. So you can see the legend continued to expand and expand and expand and add more elements to the legends. While most events are legendary, historians link Arthur to post-Roman Britain, a period of conflict with invading Saxons, suggesting he was a powerful British war leader, or a king, or a combination of both. See some fantastic pictures there of what it looked like for him and his men up top and around the round table. And then there's a picture down below of him leading his men into that famous battle at Badon, where he killed 960 men on his own. So really the legend continued to grow throughout. In terms of the historicity of Arthur, King Arthur was traditionally accepted as a historic person for most of history. He was originally thought to have been an ancient British war commander, and at least from the early 12th century, a king. There was, however, much discussion regarding his various deeds, and contemporary scholars and clerics generally refuted the popular medieval belief in his extreme longevity and future return. From the 18th century on, there has been academic debate about the historicity of Arthur. One school of thought, citing entries in the History of Britons and the Welsh Annals, saw Arthur as a genuine historical Romano-British leader who fought against the invading Anglo-Saxons sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century, and represented the type of hero the British public was desperate for in a post-Roman era, with waves of invaders coming in from all over Europe. The other text that seems to support the case for Arthur's historical existence is the 10th century Annales Cambriae, which also links Arthur with the Battle of Badon, like we talked about. The date this battle was referred to in the book was 516 to 518, and they also mentioned the Battle of Camlann, where he was killed in 537 to 539. So they've really narrowed down some of these major events that happened with Arthur, if he did exist. These details have often been used to bolster confidence in the Historia's account and to confirm that Arthur fought at Badon and was a historical figure. So again, this debate has been going on since really the 1700s and still continues today. There are many scholars and historians still looking for evidence whether Arthur really existed, and if he did, what he actually did. Was he a king? Was he a warrior? Was he a British leader? They're really trying to narrow down exactly what he was and when he existed. So who was Merlin based on? Merlin, or Welsh for Mirrodin, was a mythical figure prominently featured in the legend of King Arthur and best known as a magician or a wizard, along with several other main roles. The familiar depiction of Merlin, based on an amalgamation of historical and legendary figures, was introduced by the 12th century Catholic cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, and then built on by the French poet Robert de Boron and prose successors in the 13th century. Geoffrey's account presented Merlin as a prophet and a royal advisor to Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. Geoffrey seems to have combined earlier Welsh tales of Mirrodin and Ambrosius, two legendary Briton prophets, and no connection to Arthur at that time. And now they formed a composite figure that he called Merlinus Ambrosius. His rendering of the character became immediately popular, especially in Wales. Later, they chronicle with romance writers in France and elsewhere expanded the account to pronounce a more full, multifaceted character, creating one of the most important figures in the imagination and literature of the Middle Ages in England. At that time, he was added to the Arthurian legends and stories as an advisor and right-hand person to Arthur. You see a picture there of Merlin to the left of Arthur as he just claimed Excalibur, the sword, from the lake. And of course, he was always at the right hand of Arthur in many of the stories. You can see how Merlin was spelled in the literature back then as Merlinus, which was more of a romantic version of how they spelled Merlin. So clearly, this was a figure that was based on two prophets that did exist, Merlin and Ambrosius, and clearly Merlin was based on the combination of those two individuals. And then, of course, given many powers that probably did not exist at the time, I'm sure. So Arthur and the Holy Grail. King Arthur and the Holy Grail are central to Arthurian legend, with the quest for the mystical cup, believed to be Jesus' Last Supper chalice, becoming the ultimate spiritual journey for the Knights of the Round Table. This was the main thing they wanted to find. Really was a spiritual journey for them to be able to find their spirituality. Though Arthur himself never found it, instead pure knights like Sir Galahad did achieve it and did find it, symbolizing divine grace and the quest for spiritual perfection, ultimately leading to the fragmentation of Camelot as knights leave to seek it. So really what broke up Camelot after Arthur's death was all of them leaving Camelot to go seek the Holy Grail. The quest begins when the Grail appears miraculously at Camelot, often described as a glowing chalice or dish, testing the knight's worthiness. It represents profound spiritual fulfillment, healing, and a mystical union with God, contrasting with worldly quests. The Holy Grail first appeared in literature in the 12th century French romance Le Conte du Graal by Christian de Troyes, later evolving with the Christian meanings. The quest was a spiritual trial. Most knights, including the great Lancelot, were too sinful to achieve it, failing due to worldly attachments. Only the purest of knights succeeded, primarily Sir Galahad, who was Lancelot's son. Sir Percival also achieved it, and Sir Bors, who achieved the Grail's vision and attained spiritual enlightenment because of it. So isn't that interesting that this was the quest of the Middle Ages in England, was the Grail. Arthur was not able to achieve it because he died, but many of his knights of the Round Table did pursue it for many, many years and through legend. And you can see several did find it and achieve it and were able to hold it. So what an interesting aspect of the Arthurian legends that were added. So Arthur's grave, this is a really interesting part of the story when we talk about history versus fiction. The ancient town of Glastonbury is no stranger to myth and legend. Some believe that Joseph of Arimathea, along with young Jesus Christ, visited the town in England, and as the story goes, had Glastonbury Abbey built after Jesus' death to house the Holy Grail. The abbey is also connected to the tale of the fabled British monarch King Arthur. The medieval legend of King Arthur has links to several places in southern England, such as Tintagel Castle and Merlin's Cave. However, within the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey that he and his wife Guinevere are said to be laid to rest. You see a picture of depiction of him there after he died, before he was buried, and then just below that is where they think the actual tomb is today. And there's actually a sign there that says Arthur and Guinevere lay here to rest. And you see just to the left of that are some of the ruins of the original cathedral that was built and the abbey that is there in Glastonbury still, with many different very important markers all around it, including markers about Jesus's visit there. The theory is that in the year 1191, monks at the abbey discovered a hollow log containing two bodies with an inscription suggesting that they were of Arthur and his queen. Arthurian legends had been around for centuries, but interest had intensified a few decades prior to this, when Geoffrey of Monmouth published his Historia Regum Britanniae that we talked about. The stories became so popular that in 1278, King Edward I traveled from his castle to Glastonbury to watch the bodies who were reinterred into the tomb on the grounds. So he actually came to where this current tomb is to watch and observe with the rest of the congregation. So very interesting that he gave credence to the idea that this hollow log that was found with these two bodies, that it really was Arthur and his wife Guinevere. Of course, we'll never really know, but that's the legend. In terms of King Arthur and his legacy, King Arthur's legacy is a powerful one of myth, of chivalry, of unity, of justice, symbolizing the ideal British hero who united a nation against invaders, established the egalitarian round table, and inspired centuries of literature, art, and national identity, even though his historical existence is still debated today. His story endures through themes of moral integrity, loyalty, defending the weak, and the quest for a perfect kingdom, influencing culture from medieval tales to modern media and serving as a touch base for leadership ideals. While once accepted as historical, scholars now generally see Arthur as a legendary figure, likely based on a 6th century British war leader, combined with other leaders of the time, but heavily embellished over time by writers in various centuries following. The legend features Merlin, Queen Guinevere, the treacherous knight Lancelot, whose story with Guinevere adds themes of love and betrayal. Arthur's story, though steeped in myth, continues to resonate, appearing in modern books and films and media, ensuring his legacy is a timeless symbol of heroic leadership and a just kingdom which pursues chivalry and what is right by the people. And you see a great picture there to the bottom right of a very famous painting and artwork done several hundred years after he was purported to have lived. This is what they thought he looked like back then as king. It's really an interesting legacy of this very important historical figure that might not have really existed and really was a composition of multiple people, but still very, very important in history because you can see a lot of England's culture and historical identity is based on King Arthur. Let's talk about some of the TVs and movies that King Arthur has been portrayed in. Been portrayed by numerous actors in iconic films and TV shows like Nigel Terry in Excalibur, Richard Harris in Camelot, Sean Connery in The First Knight, one of the most famous portrayals by Sean Connery, Graham Chapman in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, maybe one of the funniest movies of all time if you have not seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And you can see a picture there to the top right of Graham, who actually plays King Arthur in that depiction. Also, TV appearances by Bradley James and Merlin. There was a great show called Winter King that came out a couple of years back. You see it there on the bottom center. And also there was a great movie called King Arthur where Charlie Hunnam was in as well. So all kinds of great materials here and modern media, movies, and TV shows you can watch if you want to learn more about King Arthur, his legend, and all the important characters in the legends. Highly recommend you dig into it. It's pretty fun. So that gives you a really good sense for King Arthur, the legends behind it, what was historical, what was fiction, what was a composite of different characters through the ages, and who were the characters that were added many years later, many centuries later by other writers and romanticists. And then the current modern historians that are still pursuing the story today and trying to connect Arthur to something real and to real facts and to real evidence. In which case, in some situations, they've actually found some things that are very curious and very interesting about King Arthur and what might have been. You can see how important the King Arthur legends are to English history. and to the people there and to the culture, and how fascinated we still are with it even today in modern day, many, many centuries later. One reason we're probably so interested is because it's almost impossible to truly prove all of the King Arthur legend itself. And so it's really a mix of history coming out of the Roman period into the Anglo-Saxon period, and also, of course, many aspects of the story were added much later with creative license by writers. Let's go ahead and take a look at some short videos, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
King Arthur is the legendary king of Camelot in British mythology. His stories, set in late 5th or early 6th century Britain, depict Arthur as the ideal king for the Britons in both war and peace. The name Arthur first appears in early Celtic folk poems dating back to the 6th century. The earliest tales about King Arthur are found in medieval romances written during the Middle Ages. In the Historia Brittonum by the Welsh cleric Nennius, dating around the 9th century and with several different versions, Arthur is depicted not as a king, but as a commander who single-handedly kills 960 men. The most important source regarding the Arthurian legend is the Historia Regum Britanniae, written in 1136. Whether King Arthur was a real British king or not is unknown. Some historians believe he was a genuine ruler, while others consider him a nobleman and a powerful commander of his time. The sword Excalibur, his wizard Merlin, and the famous Knights of the Round Table are more products of the literary works that focus on Arthur. King Uther Pendragon, a powerful king, had a wizard named Merlin who arranged for him to sleep with a queen named Igraine, who was another king's wife. Merlin's condition was that he would be given the child born from their union. All this happens, and the child is named Arthur. He is given to Sir Hector, another lord, he raised along with his own son, Kay. However, Arthur has no idea about his true identity. Years later, as Arthur grows up and participates in a royal tournament, he learns that Kay has forgotten his sword at home. Arthur finds a sword stuck in a stone in the forest. This is the sword in the stone, which can only be pulled out by the true king of Britain. At this point, Merlin returns to explain the situation to Arthur, who is unaware that he was adopted, and helps him fight against other lords who dispute his claim to the throne. According to the version told in Robert de Boron's poem Merlin, Excalibur is stuck in a stone, and the person who can pull the sword out is the true king of Bretagne. Many nobles try to pull the sword out, but none succeed. Young Arthur effortlessly pulls out the sword, proving that he is the true king. The sword in the stone is often associated with the famous weapon Excalibur, but they are two different swords. The sword Arthur pulls from the stone breaks in a battle with Sir Pellinore, and Merlin takes Arthur to a mystical body of water, where the Lady of the Lake gives him Excalibur. Excalibur is more than just a sword, it is a symbol of Arthur's greatness. This is consistent with many ancient stories and legends where a great hero has some kind of magical weapon. After forcing the other lords to accept his kingship, Arthur marries the beautiful Queen Guinevere and establishes his palace in Camelot. King Arthur invites the most distinguished knights of the kingdom to a feast. However, when the guests arrive, there is a dispute over who will sit in the best seat. Arthur seriously punishes the knight who started the fight and agrees to the round table arrangement to prevent a similar situation in the future. With this arrangement, he states that everyone at the table is equal, regardless of their social status, and that everyone's opinions will be taken seriously. He also mentions that anyone in need of help will be welcomed in the hall, and that those who make mistakes will be corrected by Arthur and his knights. The Round Table is known as a symbol rising in the heart of Camelot, the legendary kingdom of Britain. The knights gathered around this table are known for their commitment to Arthur's principles of justice and honesty. Arthur brings these knights together, who act together to defend himself and his kingdom. Arthur's closest friend and most loyal knight, Lancelot, is known as the Lancelot of the Lake. Lancelot fights alongside Arthur and protects his kingdom. However, Lancelot falls in love with Arthur's wife, Guinevere. This situation upsets the balance of Camelot and creates unrest in the kingdom. The Knights of the Round Table fight to uphold the principles of justice and honesty in Camelot. They face all kinds of challenges to defend the kingdom and its people. As they fight dragons, giants, and cunning villains, they demonstrate their courage and loyalty. The greatest adventure of the Round Table is to search for the Holy Grail. This cup has been depicted in various ways in many stories. Initially, it is described as a plate in the French version, while in Welsh, it is described as a cauldron. However, with Mallory's revision of the story, this cup is transformed into the cup used in the Last Supper and is generally understood in this way. The Holy Grail, which is said to have a healing effect, also has the power to grant eternal youth. In many sources, the Holy Grail is hidden in a castle and protected by the Fisher King. The quest for the Grail can only be completed by a pure-hearted knight, and at the end of this quest, it is achieved by Lancelot's son, Galahad. Galahad is the son of Lancelot and Igraine. He is a knight known for his purity and loyalty. He volunteers to search for the Holy Grail and faces many challenges during this quest. Galahad finally finds the Holy Grail and earns the right to be one of Arthur's knights. Guinevere, as Arthur's wife and the Queen of Camelot, plays a significant role. However, in some stories, Guinevere is kidnapped and requires rescue. Guinevere's kidnapping and subsequent rescue are legendary adventures of Arthur. In one story, Guinevere is abducted by a nobleman named Sir Meliagrance, while Arthur is participating in a tournament. Sir Meliagrance attempts to declare his love for Guinevere by imprisoning her in a castle. Guinevere, fearing this situation as she harbors no feelings for him, seeks help. Arthur, along with Sir Lancelot and a group of knights, attacks the castle to rescue Guinevere. Arthur and Sir Lancelot clandestinely enter the castle and, while rescuing Guinevere, engage in battle with Sir Meliagrance and his men. During this skirmish, Sir Meliagrance is killed and Guinevere is liberated. In another story, Guinevere is at the center of a love triangle involving Arthur and Lancelot. Despite being Arthur's queen, Guinevere harbors feelings for Lancelot. This scenario, despite Arthur being a strong leader, exposes weaknesses within the royal court. Lancelot's inability to conceal his feelings for Guinevere and her reciprocation of those emotions undermines Arthur's trust and jeopardizes the kingdom's future. This love triangle deeply impacts the relationships between Arthur's kingdom and his knights and ultimately exposes Mordred's treachery. Mordred, Arthur's cousin and also his stepson, conspires to seize Arthur's throne. Arthur attempts to kill Mordred in battle, but Mordred survives, albeit wounded. Arthur has to navigate these challenges, and his relationship with his queen and best friend remains noble until Arthur's illegitimate son and Mordred's opposition to Arthur's rule are revealed. In the final battle between Mordred and Arthur, Mordred is killed, and Arthur sustains a mortal wound. As Guinevere retreats to a monastery, Lancelot retreats into seclusion. All the other great knights of the palace are killed. Sir Bedivere assists Arthur and returns Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. When the sword is returned, Arthur dies and is taken to Avalon Island on a ship. The legend of Arthur has influenced how people interpret the world around them and has inspired them to discover their inner strengths and courage. Additionally, the modern understanding of romantic relationships has been directly or indirectly influenced by the Arthurian legend, and justice is always recognized and reciprocated. Even in defeat, the right triumphs, and after countless struggles, the knight and the young lady move away toward a long, happy life.
Although King Arthur is a popular figure today, did you know the first mention of Arthur is about 1,200 years old? The Historia Britonum mentions an Arthur related to a battle between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons after the Romans left Britain. However, the document was written about 300 years after the conflict. The legends of King Arthur we know today did not begin development until the 12th century under Geoffrey of Monmouth. Then, this British myth saw more development in France during the Middle Ages before settling into the stories we know and love today. Finding the true story behind King Arthur means examining murky periods of history like the Dark Ages. King Arthur is a much beloved character. He and his knights made Camelot a place of chivalry and adventure that continues to fascinate children and adults alike. The old stories of the Knights of the Round Table have been retold in countless books, movies, and television shows, and something about them continues to call to us today. Although King Arthur continues inspiring imagination, it is not known for sure if he existed. Some historians believe the character of King Arthur was based on a real British king, but the debate centers around which one. Early British history is filled with great kings who led their people well and fought to defend their homelands. So it's time to dive deeper into this chaotic time and look at two kings who could have inspired the legend of King Arthur. By examining these real kings, we can catch a glimpse of chivalry in the real world and see how King Arthur, while fictional, is still an essential part of Western history. Who was Ambrosius Aurelianus? Ambrosius Aurelianus is a famous character in British legends and myths, living in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Sadly, there's not much historical documentation of Ambrosius Aurelianus, partially due to the time he lived. When Rome fell to Germanic chieftain Odoacer in 476 CE, Western Europe fell into the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire had ruled parts of Western Europe for so long that the loss of that overarching stability saw a sudden decline in written history. Germanic tribes were on the move, raiding cities as they went, so literacy fell. One of the people who wrote about the 5th century was Gildas the Wise, a 6th century British monk. His sermon, De Excidio et Conquisto Britanniae, was intended to condemn his contemporaries, but the first part of the sermon narrates how Britain went from Roman conquest to Gildas's own time, including the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Thus, he is one of the most critical sources of British history for the 5th and 6th centuries, mainly because he is a near contemporary to the historical events he discusses. According to Gildas the Wise, Ambrosius Aurelianus was born into a noble family and played a significant role in the fight against the Saxons, one of the Germanic tribes that began pushing into Britain around the 6th century. They arrived along with the Angles and the Jutes. The Jutes settled around Kent, and the Angles settled in the northeast and eastern parts of the island. The Saxons eventually settled in the upper Thames Valley, but these Germanic tribes did not settle peacefully. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes found Britain was already inhabited when they arrived. Although the Romans had pulled out about 2 centuries ago, the Britons remained, and many of them were Romanized. Gildas the Wise mentioned Ambrosius Aurelianus's parents died in an early Saxon attack, which would have fueled his animosity with the Saxons. Ambrosius Aurelianus was also likely a Christian. Gildas the Wise mentions he won battles with God's help. However, some historians contend that Gildas's religion is shining through, so that statement may not accurately reflect Ambrosius Aurelianus's religious leanings. Regardless, he fought the Saxons for about 10 years, trying to push them off the coasts of England. Historians believe he was part of the Battle of Badon around 500 CE, although historians know little about it. There is little documentation about the battle, but in the little there is, Ambrosius Aurelianus is not mentioned as being directly involved. Instead, there's a mention of an Arthur in the battle, although this comes from the Historia Britonum, written in the 9th century, at least 300 years after the battle. Whoever Ambrosius Aurelianus was, he significantly impacted British myths and legends. It is unclear if King Arthur was fashioned after this great Romanized British war leader. However, many scholars agree that he eventually transformed into King Arthur's uncle and the brother of Arthur's father, who was named Uther Pendragon in literary tradition. Other scholars believe Ambrosius Aurelianus was transformed into the great wizard Merlin, who comes to Arthur to help him grow and become a successful monarch. Who was King Alfred the Great? Alfred the Great was an Anglo-Saxon king who ruled the kingdom of Wessex from 871 to 886 CE, and all British Anglo-Saxons from 886 to 899 CE. However, when he was born, no one expected him to take the throne. He was born around 849 CE as the youngest of 6 siblings, several of whom were older brothers. He was a sickly boy, and many expected that Alfred would join the church if he survived to adulthood. Thus, much of his early education centered around preparing him for monastic life, so he learned the value of reading. As a child, Alfred even accompanied his father on a trip to Rome and met Pope Leo IV, although sources are unclear if Leo IV anointed Alfred as a king or a consul. Either way, Alfred's early years focused on preparing him for a life of study, even as the political world erupted into chaos and turmoil around him. When Alfred was born, the Anglo-Saxons had ruled England for several centuries. The Anglo-Saxons were known to squabble amongst themselves over land, but they soon faced a more serious threat: the Vikings. The Vikings launched their first raid on English shores in 793 CE, but their attacks soon shifted from raiding to invading. The Viking invasions were ruthless, and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could not stand against them despite fighting fiercely. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to the Vikings one by one, so many Anglo-Saxon kings frequently found themselves on the battlefield. Alfred's older brothers held the throne in succession. As they died one by one fighting the invading Vikings, Alfred moved closer to the throne. Finally, his last brother, Ethelred, took the throne in 865 and made Alfred his successor, allowing Alfred to work closely with him to run Wessex. For several years, Alfred and Ethelred fought the Vikings. Suddenly, when King Ethelred died in 871 CE, Alfred became the King of Wessex, which was soon the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom in Britain that had not yet fallen to the Vikings. Of course, the Vikings were not satisfied with holding most of England. They continued to press into Wessex. Alfred did his best to hold them off, but in January 878 they attacked Chippingham. King Alfred barely escaped with his life. Legends say he stayed a night with an older lady, who fussed at him for burning the bread, but Alfred managed to escape. He and a small group of men hid in the marshes of Somerset. It seemed the Vikings had won. However, Alfred refused to surrender. He rallied people to him in the marshes, and in May 878, Alfred left the marshes and launched an attack against the Vikings to retake his kingdom. King Alfred won the Battle of Edington and forced the Vikings to surrender at Chippenham. His peace treaty with the Vikings included splitting England in half, the Vikings ruling the eastern half called Danelaw and Alfred ruling the western half, and making the Vikings promise to maintain peace, which Alfred had to enforce militarily. Some historians believe Alfred's victory against the Viking invaders helped fuel the King Arthur myths. Much like Alfred, King Arthur was a protector of his realm from foreign invaders. Like King Arthur, King Alfred the Great was not only a military leader. He also cared deeply about his people and wanted to help them live better lives. To help the Anglo-Saxons, King Alfred the Great began working on reforms in almost every sector, including the military, the legal system, and education. The old Anglo-Saxon military system had left them vulnerable to the Viking invasions. Alfred didn't trust the Vikings to truly honor the peace treaty, so he set up a new system of defenses and taxation. His defense system was based on a network of fortified towns. These were called burhs, and may be where the idea of the modern borough developed. Each burh was about 20 miles from farms and villages and connected by a road system designed for the army. These fortified settlements had walls built or repaired and ditches added. Some burhs even straddled rivers to prevent the Vikings from exploiting them with their boats. King Alfred also focused on legal reforms by writing his own law code, drawing heavily on previous Anglo-Saxon laws. The laws focused on honor, but they also allowed most crimes to be compensated for with money. Alfred assembled his legal code carefully, focusing on justice and his philosophical ideas of kingship. His legal code was so important to English history that it would go on to influence English law in the present era. However, some of Alfred's most important contributions were in education. The Viking raids had devastated Anglo-Saxon education. Viking raids had destroyed many churches that housed important manuscripts, and people weren't focused on learning when they had to concentrate on survival. Alfred first focused on starting a court of scholars, but he was interested in educating all free men, not just the nobility. Because the Vikings had destroyed so many books, Alfred started a program to copy influential and historical works that he thought everyone should know. These books were also translated into English because Latin literacy was rapidly declining. The increased focus on education allowed the Anglo-Saxons under King Alfred the Great to recover from the Viking attacks and, some historians argue, even helped his kingdom better prepared to defend itself from future attacks. King Alfred thought kings were tasked with caring for their people. His dedication to his duty of helping everyone, not just the nobility, may have fed the King Arthur myths, as Arthur is depicted as a just king seeking what was best for his kingdom. The legends of King Arthur are some of the most important myths in modern Western history. They have impacted how people view a just ruler and how people interact with each other. Even though King Arthur most likely did not exist, and there has never been a real Camelot, two prominent historical kings could have influenced the legend's developments. Ambrosius Aurelianus was a brave Romanized British leader who helped push the Saxons back for several years. His life comes before the earliest mentions of King Arthur, and some scholars believe his life influenced the legends, even if he was transformed into Uther Pendragon's brother or the great wizard Merlin. King Alfred came later in history, after the first mention of Arthur, but his victory over the Vikings when all others had failed proved Alfred to be a strong warrior, just like King Arthur. Alfred was also dedicated to helping his people, instituting reforms that continue to impact Great Britain today. While historians may never know who the King Arthur legends are based on, we can still celebrate Arthur and appreciate how other real-life kings reflect the values of chivalry, bravery, and honor.
So a lot of really fascinating things to talk about there. In the first segment video, you can see there that the legend of Excalibur, a lot of people thought that that was the sword that was in the stone, but actually was not. Excalibur was given to him by the Lady of the Lake, right out of the lake. And there was another sword that he grabbed out of the stone to give himself the right to the throne. He used that sword for some time, and it eventually broke in the middle of a battle. And so the reason that he visited the Lady of the Lake to go get the second sword, Excalibur, was to get one that was impenetrable or unbreakable. And so really interesting history there in the legend that there were actually two swords, and Excalibur was the second one and the unbreakable one. Some other interesting things there. You saw who some of the famous people were: Ambrosius and Alfred the Great, some of the people that historians think that he might have been based on in terms of his legend. Ambrosius being the earlier character right after Roman times, very important figure in British history. He could have been based on that in terms of his legend, and then it was probably enhanced upon because of Alfred the Great, who was considered the most just king and the king that was able to bring England back together under one kingdom instead of multiple kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon world. And so many other people they've considered that could have influenced the legacy as well, but those are probably the two most likely to have added much of the bulk of the legend of King Arthur. So much interesting information there, as you saw, about King Arthur, the legend, how it impacted British history, how we're still dealing with it today. There are many aspects of King Arthur and Alfred the Great and other really great kings that are still impacting the way that England is organized and the way Western culture is organized in terms of culture and law and the way we organize our societies, our cities, the way we treat each other, and even the romantic part of the story too, the way that we have romance and the way that we have chivalry and the way that men are expected to lead on the battlefield and protect their women, protect their cities, protect their people and their children. So a lot of those old-fashioned ways of thinking really came out of the Arthurian legends. There are still many historians today that are picking through fields in England and doing digs and finding old pottery and trying to find things that connect to the ancient King Arthur, if he did exist. And so that's really part of the fun of it, is the legend really makes it a mystery that we're still trying to put together. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle that historians were trying to piece together into one big story that we can actually tie to real facts. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about King Arthur, his legend, the history of it, what was behind it, all the different characters that are in the legend, the ones that were from way, way back in the Welsh poetry, all the way up through those that got added to the legend later as part of a romanticism or really to sell books, and got added to the legend because, as we know, back then a lot of things were oral tradition. And so when you pass things down over hundreds and hundreds of years, it gets changed a little bit. So part of the fun of it, again, in following the legend of King Arthur. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop us a comment on what you think of this episode, what you thought of the legend of King Arthur and learning more about it. And definitely dig some more into it. Go down that rabbit hole. You'll learn a lot about how it impacted British history. It was a lot. It was incredibly important to the way that they formed their culture. And drop us a comment also on a topic you'd like us to do in the future. Hopefully you love history as much as we do, and we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.